YouTube, happy Tuesday. It's time for another TMI Tuesday Trans Q&A. Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel McKinnon, making gender make sense. Let's get started. So I have a comment submitted to me on a YouTube video that I thought was really interesting, and I wanted to dedicate an entire video to address it. One of the interesting things about this question, though, is in order to address it, I have to do a fair amount of philosophy to explain what I think is going on. So this TMI Tuesday video is also going to double as a Trans 101 video. Today's topic will get into the theory of knowledge, or what we call epistemology. Okay, let's get to the question. A viewer writes in, what do you think of the perceptions of some that cisgender is itself starting to be used in a dismissive and derogatory way against people who don't agree with certain platforms? As in, it's being used as a sort of knee-jerk generalization synonym for ignorant, privileged obliviousness, etc., in place of actual discourse and rebuttals. For instance, casually saying that because someone is a cisgender white male, their perceptions on gun control are necessarily warped, and I'm not making this up. In that sense, I think there is concern that the use in the sense that it's becoming a sort of hand wave to avoid actual dialogue. I think it's something worth noting, at least based on my own anecdotal experience. Great question. I want to get into what I think is going on and when the sort of response, I'm going to call this the check your privilege response, is appropriate and when it's problematic. So I think in a lot of cases, people overestimate the problematic nature of that sort of response. There are many times where the check your privilege sort of reply is a meaningful reply. However, there are other times where it is a sort of hand-waving avoidance of an actual argument. And so I want to give some tools and some ways to think about how to distinguish between those two cases. I want to add that because this is such a great question and there's a lot going on here, that I want to spend Friday's video, the next Trans 101 video, on the nature of privilege. What does it mean to have male privilege, cis privilege, heterosexual privilege, white privilege? What does that mean? So I will spend all of Friday's video on the nature of privilege, so I don't want to get into what does it mean to have privilege in this video. I just want to focus on the ways that people are saying, check your privilege. Okay. In order to explain mostly what I think is going on and how to think about when it's appropriate and when it's not, I need to explain the theory of knowledge to you. I need to explain epistemology to you, which is great. I'm really excited, right? This is what I do. The traditional way that we think of knowledge is that we separate it into knowledge how to do something and knowledge that a certain claim or fact is true. We're going to avoid the knowledge how stuff. Knowledge how has to do with things like, I know how to bake a cake. I know how to ride a bike. But that type of knowledge is really different from the other type of knowledge, what we call propositional knowledge. Knowledge of propositions. Propositions are the parts of sentences that can be true or false. We say that they are truth apt. So the claim that today is Tuesday, for example, is, well, I'm recording this on a Friday, so it's actually false when I'm recording the video. But if you're watching this on Tuesday, the claim, today is Tuesday, is true. So sentences sometimes have propositions in them. The propositions are the part that can be true or false. It is either true that today is Tuesday, or it is false that today is Tuesday. If the claim is true, then we can talk about whether or not I know that it's true. The traditional analysis of knowledge is that knowledge is justified true belief. K equals JTB. This is sometimes known as the JTB analysis of knowledge. Now, there's a big caveat here in that pretty much since the 1960s, there's been a question of whether this is a sufficient analysis of knowledge. There's a question of whether or not there are some counterexamples known as Gettier cases, but I don't want to get into that because it doesn't matter for us. That's sort of a fine point of debate within philosophy and epistemology. I have a view on it, but it's not important for what we're doing. So let's break down this analysis of knowledge as justified true belief. Let's start with the easy part. All things that we know have to be true. Truth is a necessary condition to know something. So if I know that today is Tuesday, it must be true that today is Tuesday. Otherwise, I don't know it. When something must be true in order for you to have a different thing, we refer to that other thing as factive. So knowledge is factive. If you know a proposition, that proposition is true. That's the truth part. There is no false knowledge. There's no such thing as false knowledge. All knowledge is true. Okay, second part is belief. We're talking about the things, the mental states that we have with respect to propositions, and that they are things that we believe. So all knowledge involves a case where you believe that something is true, and then it has to be true. So those are the belief and the truth conditions, and then we need something extra. True belief is not enough to know something, because we can make lucky guesses. I could guess that the temperature in Toronto, Ontario right now is 76 Fahrenheit. I have no idea what it is. But suppose that I was right and I just guessed the right number. We don't want to say that I know that the temperature is 76 Fahrenheit in Toronto right now because I guessed. Merely having a true belief is not enough to know something. We need something extra. That's where the J for justification comes in. Justification is basically evidence. You need good enough evidence on top of a true belief to have knowledge. So in this case, good evidence to know that the temperature in Toronto right now is 76 Fahrenheit would be something like looking at the Weather Channel or Googling the current weather in Toronto. Reliable sources of information provide us good evidence for our beliefs. When good evidence produces a true belief, we know that claim. So that's the traditional analysis of knowledge in terms of justified true belief. It's gotten us pretty far. Sure, there's minor squabbles over the nature of justification and these Gettier cases, whatever, but it's done pretty well. One of the important things about this traditional analysis of knowledge is that we can schematize knowledge in a way to talk about people who believe things and the propositions they believe without having to refer to a particular person or a particular belief. We can talk about knowledge and people who know things in the abstract. So the schema that we use is some subject S knows some proposition P. S knows that P or SKP, right? This is how we talk about knowledge in epistemology all the time. We don't care who the subject is. We don't particularly care what the belief is. All we want is a subject, a belief in a proposition, and then we say, what has to be the case? The interesting thing here, though, is this traditional analysis of knowledge does not care who the person is. It assumes that it doesn't matter who the subject is or what the claim that they think that they know is. I want to push back on that. Recently, and we're talking like the last few decades here, feminists have put forward an alternate analysis of knowledge that questions this. It doesn't matter who the subject is, it doesn't matter what the proposition is. They say, no, it actually matters who the person is and what the proposition is for some people and some propositions. This cluster of views are known as feminist standpoint epistemology. Now, just like in a previous video where I talked about feminism and said, well, it's really plural because it's feminisms. There are many brands of feminism. The same applies to feminist standpoint epistemology. It's not just one. There are many. So there are feminist standpoint epistemologies. For the sake of clarity, I'm just going to talk about standpoint epistemology in the singular, and I'm just going to drop the feminist part because it's quicker to say standpoint epistemology. When you hear people talk about standpoint epistemology, this is what they're talking about. So what does feminist standpoint epistemology say? It has three theses: situated knowledge thesis, privilege thesis, and the achievement thesis. All three of these work together. Some of them go together in more important ways than others. The situated knowledge thesis is basically the claim that we have bodies, and these bodies have identities. For example, gender, race, socioeconomic class, immigrant status, ability, disability, mental health, neuroatypicality, whatever. The important thing is we have bodies with these identities, and the claim will be that the types of bodies we have matters for some of the things we can know and how easily some of us can come to know them. So the situated knowledge thesis is merely the claim we have bodies with intersectional identities, and that this will matter to what we can know and how easily we can know it. The traditional analysis of knowledge, remember, said that it doesn't matter who we are. It's very abstract in terms of epistemic agent. All of us have a mind. It doesn't matter what our body is. Right, this very old sort of Cartesian sense of the rational mind versus the emotional body, whereas feminist standpoint epistemology says, no, our minds are in bodies and that will matter. The privilege thesis takes different forms. There's a very strong form and then there are weaker forms. The very strong form is that for certain types of knowledge, you cannot know it unless you have a certain type of body. That is really, really strong though. So for example, you cannot know what it's like to be a woman and to face misogyny and women's oppression unless you are a woman. That's really strong. There's not so many people who think that that's true so much now, whereas that used to be a claim earlier on in feminist standpoint epistemology work. Most people these days take some sort of weaker claim. So it's not that without the relevant intersectional identity, you cannot know a given proposition relevant to that identity. The claim is it's harder for you to know if you don't have the relevant identity. So a man has a harder time coming to know what it's like to experience misogyny and women's oppression, for example. It's harder to know as a white person what Black people go through in terms of systemic racism, institutional racism, microaggressions, so on and so forth. The strong claim would be, as a white person, it is impossible to know. The weaker claim is that it's harder to know. It might be extremely hard. It might be nearly impossible. The weaker claim is just it's possible even if it's hard. And then there are different varieties going along the axis of difficulty to come to know. But just because you have a relevant intersectional identity does not guarantee that you will come to know the relevant proposition. Knowledge is not free in this sense. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean that you know what it's like to experience women's oppression, or you might not form any of the beliefs. Or you might form false beliefs and think that women are not oppressed, for example. So this is where the achievement thesis comes in. This claim is that you come to know about the structure of oppression based on a given identity, for example, by struggling against the oppression. The analogy I like to use is, think of, for women, the glass ceiling. So to continue the metaphor, women tend to know that there's a glass ceiling because they hit their head on it, whereas men tend to pass right through it and don't even notice it's there. By being the sort of person who tends to struggle against a type of oppression, you will come to achieve the knowledge that that oppression exists. But if you don't struggle against it, if you're a woman who doesn't believe in the glass ceiling and you don't think that you're experiencing it, then there's no guarantee that you will come to believe that the glass ceiling exists or that you will come to know that this is a source of oppression. Just because you have the relevant identity doesn't guarantee that you will know it, and just because you don't have the identity doesn't guarantee that you won't know it. We have the situated knowledge thesis, the privilege thesis, and the achievement thesis. This is feminist standpoint epistemology. One of the upshots of standpoint epistemology is that when we're talking about a type of oppression towards a given identity, we should really pay attention to what those people are telling us. So for example, if you want to have a congressional meeting on women's reproductive health care, don't have an entire panel of men. But these things happen. When we're talking about a particular identity and its oppression or matters that are relevant to that person's identity and social justice, One thing that's happening is we're saying you should highlight the voices and the views of the people who are better situated to know what it's like and what they need. You should put forward people with the relevant identities and the knowledge that they have more easily gained because they have that identity. Conversely, you should de-highlight people who don't have those identities, who are less likely or who have a harder time coming to truly know what the oppression is like. This is why, if we're talking about women of color and misogynoir that they face in society, we should ask Black women what it's like. We shouldn't really ask white men. So this is coming back to the question I was asked. When we say things like check your privilege, one thing that's going on is a standpoint epistemology point. It's saying in this debate where this identity is relevant, this identity, say a trans woman, is the type of person who's more likely to know what's going on, you as a cisgender man need to be quiet. We don't really need to hear what you think because you are less likely to know what you're talking about because of your identity and standpoint epistemology. That doesn't mean that your opinion has no value whatsoever. It just means as a starting point, we're going to give it less credibility and that we should be mindful of who is speaking and who is getting credibility. All too often, what happens is when we're talking about oppression, the identities that are being oppressed, their voices are not the ones being listened to. Their voices are not the ones being allowed to speak. Instead, it's dominantly situated individuals and their identities who are less likely to know what they're talking about. When people say, check your privilege, or, okay, we're talking about Black trans women suffering, you're a white cis dude, shut up. That's really a standpoint epistemology point. That's what's going on. And that is not to shut down debate. That is a recognition that we want to include in our discourse people who know what they're talking about. And if you are the sort of person who is less likely to have access to the relevant knowledge based on your identity, because you don't have the relevant identity, we should de-highlight your contribution. And that's a rational thing to do. We should highlight the people who are more likely to know what they're talking about. That's what things like expertise is. I know it feels like you're being told that what you say doesn't matter. The first reaction should be, wait, maybe they're right. Maybe I am too willing to contribute to a debate without thinking, well, am I actually well positioned to know what's going on here? Am I really listening to the relevant voices who are more likely to know what's going on? Many times when people say, whoa, we're talking about this and you have the wrong identity, you just need to stop talking and listen to us right now, that is a legitimate point. With that said, the example that you use about like a debate about gun control, it depends on what the debate was doing. If the debate was on, well, here's what it's like being a Black trans woman, a white trans woman, a Latina, lesbian, cisgender woman, whatever. When you have this debate about gun control, here's how it feels for us. It might make sense to say you are an identity of the social power dominant class. Maybe you should listen to us more. And so invoking someone's identity as a cis white male might be relevant to the discussion about gun control. It depends on how it was used. However, there are some cases, I think that they are more rare than people think, where people are wrongly invoking a sort of standpoint epistemology point when the identities are not relevant. I can see how this debate about gun control, for example, the invoking of your identity as a cis white male might have actually been irrelevant. If it was irrelevant, then it is a kind of shutting down, hand-waving way to stop discourse. And that's a problem. So I want to flag that yes, sometimes this is being invoked in an inappropriate way. However, I think it's way more rare than people think. Generally, if you are a member of a socially dominant group, in this case, cis white male, compared to a black trans woman, for example, then you are not used to your ideas being dismissed based on who you are. But if you're a member of a marginalized group, you're used to that all the time. Also, if you're a member of the marginalized group, we live in a society where the dominant groups speak all the time. We know what you think, generally before you say it. And for some debates, we don't need it repeated. We already know what you think. We want you to listen to us. And it's not normal if you're in the dominant group to hear that. It's an unusual experience. You're just used to an entitlement where your contribution gets treated equally. But the feminist standpoint, epistemology point, is that based on who you are, depending on the debate we're having, your viewpoint isn't equally valuable. So it depends on how this was deployed. There are some problematic uses, but I think that they're more rare than people think. Thank you for that question. It was a really good one. So thanks for watching. I hope it was interesting to learn about feminist standpoint epistemology. If you have a comment or a question, please leave it down below. Please remember to like the video and subscribe for future videos. Thank you.